A very warm welcome everyone to the Maritime Education Podcast. My name is Barry Sadler and today we're going to be talking about emissions from ships. Before we start to talk about the recent developments that have come out from the IMO in the last few weeks, let's look a little bit at the history of global warming and how we got from where we were to where we are today with international cooperation on global warming. Scientists first drew the world's attention to global warming back in the 60s and 70s when they recognized that large concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere were increasingly leading to damages to the various layers of the Earth's protection, and this started to increase the temperature on Earth. It took years before the international community responded to this particular warning, but in 1988 the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was created by the World Meteorological Organization, and the United Nations came along and created an environment program which issued first assessment reports in 1990 that reflected the views of around 400 scientists who stated that global warming was real and urged that something was done about it. Now, obviously as time ticked by, the urgency became more and more real, and this resulted in a conference on the environment being held in Rio in 1992. Some of you may have known it as the Earth Summit. Now, this basically sat down and said, we need to do something about the rising temperatures. We need to do something about the damage to the protective layer around the Earth, which is stopping global warming from happening. The Kyoto Protocol, which you may have heard of in 1997, was an international agreement that basically linked the United Nations with 37 industrialized countries and the European community, and they signed the Kyoto Protocol in order to start to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The detailed rules for the implementation of the protocol were adopted in Marrakesh in 2001, and these were called the Marrakesh Accords, and the Kyoto Protocol itself entered into force in February 2005. The important thing to remember about the Kyoto Protocol was that it only targeted 37 industrialized countries and the European community. It targeted those for reducing greenhouse gases, and those were identified as the countries that were emitting the most CO2, doing the most damage to the Earth's environment. Now, the Kyoto Protocol stayed into force for quite some time until we came to Paris in 2015. Now, the Paris Agreement in 2015 was a significant agreement. So it came after what's known as the United Nations Climate Change Conference. A lot of you will know this as COP. And COP21 was held in Paris in France, and the 2015 Paris Agreement was signed by nearly 200 countries and entered into force in November 2016. Now, its central goal was to combat climate change and accelerate actions towards a sustainable, low-carbon future by including all the world's nations in the agreement. That was the restriction on Kyoto. Kyoto placed obligations on just 37 countries, whereas the Paris Agreement was so significant that it placed obligations on the majority of the world and encouraged those countries that were better off to help those countries that would struggle financially to start to impose the restrictions necessary to limit global warming. Now, The key objectives of that Paris Agreement were to limit that global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The Paris Agreement increased the ability to adapt to climate change impacts and foster climate resilience and low greenhouse gas emissions development by mobilising finance to support climate resilient development and emission reductions in those countries that weren't as well off as others. This continued all the way through to where we are now in trying to reach a sustainable level of global warming. But as far as shipping is concerned, neither the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, or its aviation counterpart, neither of these were referenced in any of the articles of the 2015 Paris Agreement on climate change. The main reason for this is that shipping is an international organization. It's an international industry, and Kyoto, and to a certain extent Paris, targeted individual countries. So to be able to allow those countries to apply emission controls on a global scale was a challenge that the IMO faced. The IMO realised that this was going to be a challenge way back in 1997, and they had a conference, MARPOL conference, which developed a new annex to MARPOL Annex 6, which addressed some of the things that Kyoto had brought up and introduced the ability for ships to comply with some of these stringent requirements on the reduction of global warming. MARPOL Annex 6 also adopted Resolution 8 on CO2 emissions from ships, and that resolution invited the Marine Environment Protection Committee, a committee within the IMO itself, to consider what CO2 reduction strategies might be feasible in light of a relationship between CO2 and other atmospheric and marine pollutions. The resolution also invited the IMO, in cooperation with the United Nations, to undertake a study of CO2 emissions from ships for the purposes of establishing the amount and relative percentage of CO2 emissions from ships as part of the global inventory of CO2 emissions. Now, the result of this was that in 2000 the IMO started its greenhouse gas studies and started to publish an estimation as to the amount of contribution that shipping was making. So as far as CO2 emissions concerned, in 1996 international shipping contributed to around 1.8% of the world's total CO2 emissions. A second study that was published in 2009 estimated that annual shipping emissions in 2007 were up to 2.7% of the global CO2 emissions. The third study that the IMO undertook was in 2014, and from that it estimated that it had dropped very slightly to 2.2%, but the study also updated the estimates for back in 2007 and brought that up to 2.8%. So reading between the lines there, shipping is contributing somewhere between 2 and 3% of the total CO2 emissions around the world. Now, obviously, the IMO recognised that we needed to address this because that's a significant contribution that one industry is making to the total CO2 emissions. And the IMO started to set out its various timelines in order to achieve a reduction in greenhouse gases to stop the international shipping organisations being blamed for such a huge amount of CO2 being emitted. Obviously, one of the quickest and easiest ways to reduce CO2 emissions is to increase the energy efficiency of international shipping. And in July 2011, the IMO adopted mandatory measures to improve energy efficiency of ships. Now, this included new ships being issued with something called an Energy Efficiency Design Index, and new ships requiring a Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan. The Energy Efficiency Design Index was applicable to just new ships, and it set out a minimum energy efficiency level for the work undertaken by that ship. Now, the Energy Efficiency Design Index was given as a reading of CO2 emissions per tonne mile for different types of ships and sizes. The Shipboard Energy Efficiency Management Plan was a plan that set out what must be done on board the ship in order for the ship to meet that design index. Now, this was all about new ships back in 2013. It didn't apply to existing ships, so it allowed a lot of the reductions to be incorporated into the way that ships were designed. So they were designed and constructed to be more energy efficient, and therefore meeting this design index. The design index reflects back to something called the baseline index, which was generated in 2008 from those studies regarding the emissions of CO2 and wanting to pull ships' energy efficiency emissions below that baseline level in order to achieve the required systematic reduction that the IMO was wanting to achieve. So in 2013, as I say, these requirements came into force and new build ships were issued with an Energy Efficiency Design Index. They must have carried a Shipboard Energy Efficiency Management Plan. And following inclusion of this into international standards, it would have embraced around 85% of emissions from international shipping. Now, EEDI reduction factors were set until 2025, so set until this year, to the extent that ships constructed in 2025 will be required to be at least 30% more energy efficient than those constructed in 2014. So essentially what we're saying is we're bringing the baseline down from that 2008 level and saying that a new ship that's constructed year on year up until this year need to be at least 30% more efficient than previous vessels. Now, things have really moved on since then. So whilst the EEDI applied to new builds, we needed something that applied to existing ships. And existing ships must now comply with what's known as the EEXI. The EEXI is the energy efficiency existing ship, and it complements the EEDI by basically addressing the energy performance of ships that were built prior to the 1st of January 2013, when the EEDI came into effect. Now, what it essentially means is that a ship that was built before the Energy Efficiency Design Index came in must demonstrate compliance by looking at the amount of fuel that it uses, minimizing the amount of fuel that it uses, and setting an existing ship index from that. Once that ship index had been set for existing ships, again, year on year, that ship would be expected to improve on that existing design index. The way it did this was by reviewing its Shipboard Energy Efficiency Management Plan and reviewing the amount of fuel that it used. This brought about something called the Carbon Index Indicator. The Carbon Index Indicator basically came into force in the 1st of January 2023, when measurements must be made by every vessel and reported back to the flag state as to how much fuel was used and how many miles were travelled. Now, essentially, a carbon index indicator shows exactly how much fuel is being used, but also looks at how fast the ship went from A to B, whether it rushed to another port only to stay at anchor, which meant that it may have potentially used more fuel, whether it was in ballast, whether it was laden. So the carbon index indicator essentially was a way of the ship owner reporting back as to how efficient their ship was. In order to ensure that an understanding of a ship's efficiency was achieved, what the IMO did was they split that carbon index indicator into 4 bands, bands A to E. Essentially, bands A, B and C are the bands that are considered where a ship is able to demonstrate that its efficiency meets the required either Energy Efficiency Design Index if it was new from 2013, or the existing index if it was already built by that date. Now, the recording of this, A, B, C, if you fell into bands A, B and C, then essentially you were seen to be below or at the design index level that your ship was able to achieve. If you were in band D, you were fundamentally given 3 years to improve the way you operate in order to bring you up to an equivalent band C. If you were down in band E, then you were given a year to review your shipboard energy efficiency management plan and make the changes necessary to put you up to band D. Now, this is all very well, but there was no real penalty for ships that were unable to get themselves out of band E into band D. We don't know about band D to C yet because we've gone 3 years down the line. But what the IMO foresaw as happening is that as the market evolved, that there would be a natural move away from those ships who were unable to get themselves out of band E. In other words, insurance, chartering, commercial activities of these vessels would be made very, very difficult if their carbon index indicator, when it was calculated, showed that they were down at band E for more than a year. So the IMO relied really on the ship owners and the market to try and sort this out for themselves. And we're still kind of waiting for that to happen. We're waiting for the market, the industry, if you like, to almost self-regulate itself. This was pretty much the case until the Marine Environment Protection Committee met back in beginning of April of this year, and they came out with the new IMO net zero framework. Now, in the process of the IMO introducing all of these initiatives to reduce emissions from ships, it was recognised eventually that the industry needed to try and achieve a net zero index. That's a big ask for such a huge industry when you consider that so much of the world's goods, 90% of the world's goods, are transported by ship. Getting the entire industry to move over to a carbon neutral operation is a huge thing. And ultimately, the IMO decided yes, that was going to be the case, and have now stated that by 2050 they want shipping to be a carbon neutral industry. Now, obviously, this is a massive step forward for the IMO to recognise the necessity to do that, and the strategy sets clear targets and actions to decarbonize international shipping and bring it to net zero at or around 2050. Now they're not going straight to that. They have got some checkpoints, if you like, along the way. So some indicative checkpoints that they would like to see international shipping agree by complying with the existing EEDI, EEXI and carbon indicator requirements are a reduction of 20% of greenhouse gases by 2030, 70% of greenhouse gases by 2040 and carbon neutral by 2050. Now, obviously, this is a huge strategy for the IMO to be adopting, but they have ways and means of trying to make this strategy as, shall we say, appealing as possible to international ship owners. Now, the key elements of this net zero framework is that it already includes the 108 parties that are party to the MARPOL Annex 6 convention. Okay, that covers 97% of the world's merchant fleet. It's important to recognise that a lot of these requirements that I've discussed apply to vessels over 5,000 gross tons. Now, a lot of people throw their arms in the air and say, what about the smaller ships? What about all their pollution? And it's quite right, the smaller ships do contribute, but as far as international shipping is concerned, ships over 5,000 gross ton make up 85% of the operational vessels around the world. Now, we don't have to worry about vessels operating within a single country, because vessels operating within a single country will be subject to that country's national reduction in greenhouse gas agreed by Kyoto and subsequently by Paris. We are talking about international shipping here, and so ships over 5,000 gross tons make up that 85%. Now, fundamentally, the draft regulations that they set out back at the beginning of this month, ships will be required to comply with global fuel standards, so they must reduce over time their annual greenhouse gas fuel intensity. That is how much greenhouse gas is emitted for each unit of energy used, and it's calculated in what we call a well-to-wake approach. So basically it's calculated based on oil used to distance travelled. The IMO also set out a global economic measure. So ships emitting above global thresholds will have to acquire what's called remedial units to balance any deficiency that they may have in that. So what they're saying is that once they've set these thresholds, if a ship owner's ship doesn't meet those thresholds and is emitting more than what the IMO have set, then it will actually have to acquire units to balance any greenhouse gas deficiency that its ships are producing. Now, ensuring compliance means that there will fundamentally be two levels: the greenhouse gas fuel intensity target, a base target and a direct compliance target to which ships would be eligible to earn surplus units. So what they're saying is, based upon the base target, if you use more fuel and therefore emit more greenhouse gas than that base target, then you will be deficient in your unit. But if you use less, then you will acquire surplus units. So ships that emit above the set thresholds can balance their emissions deficit by either transferring the surplus units from those ships that are really efficient to those ships that are not quite as efficient as they should be. They can bank surplus units, so if they have banked surplus units and not transferred them to other vessels, they can keep those surplus units banked with the IMO and use them as necessary to offset any ships that aren't meeting the base target. They can also acquire remedial units by making contributions to the IMO Net Zero Fund. So the IMO Net Zero Fund will be established to collect pricing contributions from emissions, and the revenues from this will be basically dispersed to reward low emission ships by giving them this credit, if you like, in their units, support innovation, research, infrastructure, to fund training and technology, and to mitigate any negative impacts on vulnerable states such as small island developing states, which we talked about the Paris Accord bringing into play. So what was fundamentally announced at the beginning of this month by the IMO that has created this new way of thinking is confirmation that we want to be a net zero industry by 2050, and a clear plan now as to how that's going to be achieved using base targets, using greenhouse gas fuel intensity targets, and if your ship uses too many, you'll be in deficit. If you're under that, you'll be in credit, and you can even buy credits back from the IMO by contributing to this fund. Essentially, what this means is that if a ship owner builds ships whose greenhouse gas fuel intensity is very, very low, that's going to put them massively in credit with the IMO. That credit can be used from the IMO by tapping into this net zero fund created by ship owners contributing where their ships actually burn too much fuel and go above those base targets. Sounds a bit complicated, but essentially it's buying and it's selling surplus units or deficit units with the IMO to try and drive ship owners to invest more in various means to reduce greenhouse gases and reduce or increase energy efficiency. At the end of the day, that's what the Energy Efficiency Design Index set out to do from the word go. It set out to encourage shipbuilders and ship owners to do their own thing, and the IMO didn't care what that thing was. They didn't care how it was done. Yeah, they just wanted ships to be constructed to be more energy efficient. If the ship owners have been doing their bit since the EEDI was brought into force, then we should be at a point where innovation will allow a ship owner to run their ship and emit greenhouse gases way, way below the baseline that is set, and therefore they would benefit from this IMO net zero fund that's being set up. It is a way, if you like, of internationally fining ships for not meeting required energy efficiency targets, but that's the way the world works at the end of the day. If innovation needs to be sparked by ship owners losing out in that respect, then that's how the IMO will push it. And at the end of the day, when you come to charter a ship, when you come to move a piece of cargo, when you come to buy something that needs to be shipped in, consumers and clients, the end user of a product, are becoming more and more aware of the carbon footprint of the products that they are offering. So a company that offers a product with a huge carbon footprint because it was brought to the UK on a very inefficient ship is going to increasingly find it difficult to move those products on to any real profit or gain without having to take a hit from the consumer by reducing prices because their goods have such a large carbon footprint. Those that can show that their goods were transported to the point of use using the most efficient ships contributing the least to global warming, complying as close as possible to both Kyoto 1997 and Paris 2015, are going to find it much easier to promote their wares and much easier to sell their wares as the entire world becomes a lot more conscious of the effects that industries, including shipping, are having on global warming. I hope you found this podcast interesting. The strive towards being a carbon neutral industry, I think, is something that a lot of people thought would never happen. But now we have a clear strategy and a date for that to happen, and the IMO will continue to push their reduction strategies forward, and hopefully governments will embrace this, ship owners will embrace it, and at the end of the day, shipping will reach its carbon neutral goal in 2050. Thank you all very, very much for listening to the podcast, everyone. I look forward to welcoming you back soon. In the meantime, have a great day.